We're all born with the major scale imprinted on our minds, whether it be a little kiddie's toy xylophone or indeed somebody singing in a concert hall. Now, we also have these things called modes, which derive from this major scale. What are they then? And how do we use them? Let's take a look. The major scale then goes like this. That's a sound that we're all familiar with, and it goes with something called a chord. We have a C major chord, which is the first, the third and the fifth of the scale. I'm going to put that in the left hand so that I can play my scale over it. There we go. Now, the distances between the notes in the scale are what gives it its complexion or flavour. So in C major we have a step at the beginning, and then another step, and then a half step. Then another step, then another step, and another step, and then a half step to finish. So between the third and the fourth notes and the seventh and the eighth, or the first note of the scale, because number 8 is the same as number 1, we have a half step. Now, this is where you have no note in between, like a black note. So a step is 2 half steps. So a half step from C will give you your C sharp. So how the modes work is a major scale starting on a different note of that scale but retaining exactly the same notes. Now the difference here is that the distance between these notes changes. Remember how C major had a half step between the third and the fourth and the seventh and the eighth? Well, if I was to start this scale on the second note, I get what's called a Dorian mode. Completely changes the complexion of this scale, and actually going from a major scale we go to a minor one. So this time my chord has actually come up to the second of the scale, so I've got a D minor chord here. That's called the Dorian on D. And this time the half steps come between the second and the third and the sixth and the seventh notes. So the whole thing is shifted a bit. Now if I go to the next one, I get a really weird sounding scale called a Phrygian mode. Sounds pretty out there. If I go to the fourth of the scale, I get something called a Lydian mode. Now this some people would say, oh, this doesn't sound right, it should go like this. But that's a different key altogether. We're still in the key of C major, but these modes begin on different notes. So Lydian on F is in the key of C major. Then we have the fifth note, Mixolydian. Then we have the Aeolian, which is sometimes called the natural minor or melodic minor coming down. So that's Aeolian on A. Then the next one is proper weird. We've got something called the Locrian mode. You think, okay, well, how do I use all of these? It's all very well knowing what they are, but actually it's how we use them. How are we going to do this? Well, the Dorian mode is a really good thing to jam over a minor chord. Picking 3 of these modes, we're going to look at the Dorian mode, the Mixolydian mode, and the Lydian mode. Because actually these are the 3 main ones that you would use in common parlance. So, for a minor chord, you could use your Dorian mode. Now, of course, it's a scale running up and down, which is something that we need to avoid when we're actually creating and playing solos and that sort of thing. do something like that, where you start to leave gaps between the notes. Now, the helpful thing with D Dorian, or Dorian on D, I should say, is that it's all white notes, and all of those notes work very well. This gives you quite a lot of freedom, because you know that any white note that you play is going to work. You can do anything. So if you're playing piano, just put a D minor chord, which is D, F and A. And you can create anything here. Absolutely anything with your right hand, just using those white notes. Now, of course, some notes are going to work better than others, and some notes in combination are not going to work so well. Maybe not. That works a bit better. That works a bit better still. Something like this. It's not going to work so well just because of which notes you're using and in what order. Now, that is down to experience. That is just down to playing and working out which notes are going to work the best. Now, if you've got D, F and A here, try not using those notes here, because you don't need to, because you've already got them here. So I use the other four notes there, the G, the E, the B and the C. So you can create some nice chords using that as well. So if we just use the G, the B, the C and the E to solo with, it now just gives it a bit more of a complexion, because you're not using the notes in this chord anymore. There's the Dorian mode, so that's good for jamming over minor chords. So if you see D minor or D minor 7, it means you can use any white note in the right hand with a D minor chord here. Now, the next one we're going to look at is the Lydian. Now, just remembering this is the one that begins on the 5th note of the scale. This is really good for blues. It's got that sort of edge. Now, the scale does this, the Lydian on G. But we have ourselves a problem in that the 4th note of this scale clashes rather. So if you're using the Lydian mode over a major chord, avoid the 4th note. Now, this only leaves you with 6 notes instead of 7. But it's enough, you know. So I've just avoided the C there. It's a good practice to avoid that 4th note. Actually, what you can do is you can use something called the Lydian dominant, which is the Lydian mode, but with the 4th sharpened like that. The actual answer to all of this is that any note is actually fair game, as long as you don't stay on it too long. If you come to rest on a note that works, actually you can legitimise things that didn't go so well beforehand, so don't fret too much about that. Now, the last mode I'm going to talk about is the Lydian mode. Now, this is what happens when you put the C major scale that begins on the 4th note. here, all of the notes work really well, unless we have something called an F major 7 chord. If I use that, actually the first note of the scale doesn't work very well at all. So if you're using the Lydian mode, avoid the first note and just use the others. So I've avoided the F in both cases there. But as I said before with the Dorian mode, if you don't use notes that are in your chord, in your major chord, actually you can get away with that anyway. None of those notes use the chords, the notes in the chord here. So I didn't use any notes there, just the remaining 4 out of my 7 notes of the scale. Doesn't mean you can't use them, and sometimes actually it's nice to refer back to the chord a bit. So I am using some of the notes in that chord. Now, there is essentially an overview to the 3 main modes in addition to your major scale. Now, here's where it might get tricky. If you're having to think about a scale starting on a particular note, it can actually get really confusing. If you're looking at, I don't know, G minor, and you think, what's that? G is the second note of F, so it would be an F major scale. Now, things like that can get really tricky, so it's useful to think of modes in terms of the adjustments that you have to make to a major scale. Now, just looking at the Dorian on D, we know that that is the second note of C major. But what if we were to look at this in terms of what D major is? A D major scale does this. So a Dorian on D involves flattening the 3rd and the 7th notes. So instead of F sharp and C sharp there, we get F and C. So if you have any major scale, all you have to do is to flatten the 3rd and the 7th notes and you get a minor one, you get your Dorian. So for example, C minor. There's our C major scale. If we flatten the 3rd and the 7th notes, we get this. We get that. So if you flatten the 3rd and the 7th, you get your Dorian. Now, you can do the same thing with the Mixolydian. Let's say we've got the Mixolydian, let's just remember, is the 5th note of your major scale. The one that's really good for blues. However, this involves flattening the 7th note only. So if I was to go to C Mixolydian, for example, there's my flattened 7th note. So if you know your major key signatures, actually, you can get your modes by simply making adjustments rather than thinking about where they start in terms of the major scale. Lastly, we've got the Lydian mode. Now, this one works over a major or a major 7 chord. And then, as I said before, avoiding that first note if you can, if you've got this major 7 chord here. So you're avoiding the first note. However, one thing that we have here in the Lydian mode is we have something called the sharpened 4th. So if I play C, that's the Lydian on C. So I haven't had to worry about what key it's in. I simply take the major scale and make those adjustments. So those will come up in the summary at the end of this video. If you like what you see, hit subscribe and the alarm bell, and donate to my channel as well. That will make me make more videos for you.